Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Sejam bem-vindos a mais um Colóquio CTS, o 7º desta primeira edição, 2021. Hoje é uma terça-feira, não é? Excepcionalmente, como já todos deverão ter reparado, por conta do feriado na Europa, não é? Com a sessão de hoje e a próxima, dia 7 de junho, sobre inovação aberta, temos 2 sessões dedicadas aos estudos críticos de inovação. Além dos oradores da sessão de hoje, que estão conforme está no programa, que nos irão falar sobre governança da inovação, temos connosco também um convidado especial que irá moderar a sessão, como temos adotado esta prática de envolver colegas também na condução destas sessões. Como podem depreender, não é, cortesia com os convidados de hoje, a sessão será toda em inglês e os que tiverem, fica aqui a dica, os que tiverem mais dificuldade poderão depois também assistir a sessão gravada e ativar, não é, as legendas da sessão. Seguiremos, contudo, a mesma metodologia de trabalho, a mesma abordagem das últimas sessões. Vocês podem interpelar os nossos convidados por meio do chat, não é? Dentro do possível, portanto, nos deixando hoje as questões em inglês, mas não sendo possível, em português serve perfeitamente. Podem colocar as questões em português, nós mesmo faremos, portanto, a tradução. So, as I just said in Portuguese, courtesy to our guests today, I'm going to switch my chip to English, so I suggest you all to do the same. Before passing the word to our moderator, let me first give you our welcoming to the guests we have today, including our moderator. I would like to give some words. As special guest, we have Rick Holzgans from Germany, though I'm not sure he is a German or a Dutch. He might correct here also. I am pronouncing his name because he's a researcher from TU Dortmund, the Technical University of Dortmund, and a PhD from the University of Groningen, the Netherlands, on energy transitions, sustainability challenges in historical and comparative perspective. His main focus of work is on sustainable development and sustainable business, social innovations in the field of sustainability, transformation processes, economic history. I also believe he has a primary background on designer studies, industrial design, an area that, for example, in Brazil has a good entrance in the STS field. And Rick, he has been working on innovation studies as our guests today, addressing this new phenomena like innovation, sustainable innovation, user-driven innovation, new labels of innovation practices and policies. And he is also, as well as Cornelius, a colleague from our journal, Innovation, Critical Studies of Innovation, and both are organizing the first Innovation Forum dedicated to the critical studies of innovation in next September. So in short, it is truly a luxury to have here Rick with us in this STS cycle of conferences, which have been interesting here to foster some North-South dialogue and North-South debates. And I believe today this is certainly just a warm-up to have Rick here in the near future as a main speaker. Of course, it is up now to you, Rick, to moderate our session and introduce our speakers today. Thank you, Rick, once more. It is a pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Tiago. Thanks for this introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not quite sure. My Portuguese is not very good. So I'm not quite sure in how far you already also introduced our session and our topic for today. But today we'll be looking at innovation governance, and as you already mentioned, we have Cornelius Schubert to join us today for a presentation, and Carolina Bagotoli. So I'm looking very much forward to these presentations. Yeah, just a little bit about myself. Indeed, I am Dutch and now working in Germany. So reverse route that Cornelius has taken, who's actually German and now since a couple of months working in the Netherlands. I think you also already mentioned, but I'm not quite sure about questions that can be asked indeed in the chat, also in Portuguese. We'll make sure to have them translated. So feel free to ask your questions in English, of course, but also feel free to write them in Portuguese. We have them translated and then asked our participants. Yeah, so in line with the format and in line with the presentations that have been going on in this international colloquium before, we have 2 presentations, 20 to 30 minutes each. And yeah, we'll start with Cornelius Schubert. Cornelius is Associate Professor for Digitized Innovation at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. He has worked in different universities in Germany. He holds a PhD in sociology and also habilitation in sociology, both from the Technical University of Berlin. And as a sociologist of technology, Cornelius is interested in the relationship of technological and social innovations and bringing social science expertise into technological design. So bringing together both perspectives of technical change and social change, social innovation. And Cornelius, we look forward to your presentation on innovation governance. So like I said, you have 20 to 30 minutes and well, the floor is yours and we'll collect some questions in the chat and have a discussion round with Carolina afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much. My presentation today will be on innovation governance, and what I would like to do is just to give you some insights from STI studies, so Science, Technology, Innovation Studies. Thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks, Rick, for the introduction. There's not much more to say. So I've been researching innovation for nearly 2 decades now, and working in a couple of interdisciplinary projects. And what I'll present today basically draws from a lot of these research projects and tries to draw some of the strands of research that I've tried to bring together also in this presentation. So the overview of what I would like to discuss and present today is that I'll first talk about the relation between innovation and governance in a very broad term. I'll then take a look at how science, technology, and innovation studies, so STI studies or STS, whoever you ask, science, technology studies, how they approach, or how some of these scholars approach innovation, and the question of governance. And I will then, in a second part, look at how a specific type of innovation studies, namely innovation studies that take an evolutionary perspective, may have become performative in themselves, so they have an impact on the way that innovation is perceived and governed or managed. And then I will end with a very short conclusion. And because I'm sitting in front of the screen, I can see my own slides. I can't see any faces, so if you have questions, please do type them in the chat, and then Rick will relay them to me, ask me. So if there's something is unclear, either ask that directly, and I'm happy to explain that on the spot, or we will wait for the discussion at the end. So for a brief introduction on innovation and governance, let's start with innovation. And I think it's important to first note how innovation has taken shape in the way that we talk about innovation. And this is an incomplete list of the terms that are associated with innovation, but the most prominent and public meaning of innovation is probably what we would call techno-economic innovation. So a technical innovation that is then exploited economically, that somehow happens in the economic realm in industries. This understanding is not the initial understanding of innovation, as Benoit Godin has very nicely shown, because innovation used to be rather a derogative term for social reform and social change in the 19th century. And it's only in the 20th century that innovation takes on a positive connotation, that it gets strongly linked with technical and economic aspects, and then develops into these subspecies of, for instance, radical or incremental innovation or process and product innovation. So when we look at the field of innovation studies and the way that people approach innovation, we often see these different dimensions, things being radical, things being incremental, but it all or mostly relates to questions of techno-economic innovation, that being the focus. However, in recent years, new meanings of innovation have been introduced. One very prominent one is social innovation. It's also a type of innovation that I've studied on in more detail. Thiago also mentioned sustainable innovation, user-driven innovation. There's frugal innovation. There's responsible innovation, and you can already see why this list must be incomplete. In preparation for this talk, I looked through all the different terms and started to write them down, and then I realized that there's just too many. We see that innovation somehow becomes more prominent, more popular, and that innovation is in a way then detached from its standard meaning of techno-economic innovation and put into a connotation with other meanings. Also, we have open innovation, or models that are still concerned with innovation, but that don't necessarily use the term. So the triple, quadruple, and quintuple helix models of how science, industry, society, policy relate with each other, models of co-creation, they're all models where we think about how does innovation happen, and especially questions of social innovation, frugal innovation, responsible innovation, but also open innovation. They also start to ask questions of how is it governed? So we slowly see that innovation always comes with the questions of governance, because it seems that it needs to be governed. And this is a main development in talking about innovation. However, we could also take a different perspective, and that's going back to a paper by Merton on social structure and enemy, where he talks about innovation as a form of social change, a form where people share the same cultural goals but lack the institutional means, so they become innovative in the way they create new means to achieve the shared goals. And so then when we talk about innovation, we don't talk about specific techno-economic innovation or frugal social innovation, but we talk about a specific mode of social change that is distinct from other modes of social change. However, this connotation of innovation isn't as prominent today. So we see the other types of innovations more strongly, but within an STS perspective, it's interesting to see that when we go back, we still find innovation, but in different forms and in different terms. And what I find quite interesting as an STS scholar is that innovation used to be considered primarily as a mode of socio-technical change. So when you look at the works of William Ogburn, for instance, and his concept of the cultural lag, you see that he talks about innovations, or what we now would call innovations. He doesn't use the term that much. And he says that these innovations turn into cultural lags and then create societal maladjustments and then create pressure to adapt. So that concept of cultural lags is from the early 20th century, 1920s. The idea is we have a lot of changes in what Ogburn calls the material culture that creates advances in the material culture. Other areas of culture lag behind, a cultural lag that creates societal maladjustments and the pressure to adapt. But Ogburn doesn't talk about this in the form of means, but he just sees that the mode of change in society changes towards this cultural lag. A different perspective on very much a similar process is proposed by Schumpeter and his concept of creative destruction in Capitalist Dynamics, where he says, well, innovation actually comes from entrepreneurs who are in a capitalist dynamic and who see the pressure to change in order to create more profit. And so, again, innovation becomes an important motive of change, but is something that is already there within capitalist dynamics, societal dynamics. It's a mode of change, of social and technical change that emerges with typically modern society after industrialization. And this idea of innovation is more strongly pronounced until the Second World War. And after the Second World War, the idea of innovation changes again, and it changes to innovation becoming a means for socio-technical change. So after World War II, innovation policy and innovation management start to emerge. And innovation becomes a target of funding, of policy, and this is where we see that innovation governance actually emerges on a larger scale as innovation turns from a mode to a reflexive means of societal change in order to address societal challenges. So when we look at how innovation is often talked about today, we see that, especially in innovation governance, innovation is used in an instrumental term. Innovation is what we need to use in order to address the coming grand challenges. This is, from an STS perspective, quite interesting to see, okay, how does this emergence of a reflexive instrument of innovation come about? Because that is what we then can study. We can look at how does the governance of innovation change over the years. And with innovation becoming more prominent, we can also see that science and technology and innovation studies emerge. And one large area, or one overlapping area in which innovation becomes prominent in science and technology studies is the emergence of evolutionary innovation studies around the late 1970s, early 1980s. Most prominently in evolutionary economics by Nelson and Winter, where they proposed a model, an evolutionary model of innovation in contrast to the then dominant neoclassical and neoliberal model. So we can see already a move in economics, but we can also see a move towards evolutionary studies of innovation in history, especially the concept of large technical systems by Thomas Hughes in his book Networks of Power, where he also uses evolutionary metaphors to describe innovation processes. And we can see A similar move in sociology and STS, for instance, the social construction of technology by Pinch and Biker, where they also draw on evolutionary metaphors, first of all, to describe innovation processes. These studies form like a nascent field in which this understanding of innovation as something evolutionary grows, where these fields cross-pollinate themselves, and this idea of an evolutionary innovation studies emerges then through the 1980s and 90s, with a lot more scholars engaged in this than these few that I've mentioned here. And the main idea of this evolutionary studies is to look at the process of innovation, so from invention to diffusion, as a process of variation, selection, and retention. So this is where the biological evolutionary metaphors come in. You look at innovation as basically three phases. So you have a variation phase, then you have a selection, and you have a retention. And these evolutionary innovation studies are in many cases directly opposed to the then prominent linear, or what is called the linear model of innovation, and they're quite critical of innovation governance. So these studies start to think about, okay, can innovation actually be governed? Can it be predicted? Can it be foreseen? And they're quite critical of that opportunity. And I think the quote by Nelson and Winter from their seminal book on evolutionary economics kind of sums it up very nicely, where they say, we think of organizations as being typically much better at the task of self-maintenance in a constant environment than they are at major change, and much better at changing in the direction of more of the same than they are at any other kind of change. So even coming from economics, this is quite a critical perspective on the governability of innovation. And so from this nascent field in the coming years, develop ideas about how to then be able to govern such evolutionary innovation dynamics, because as a consequence of them being evolutionary and being characterized by emergence, they are difficult to predict, steer, govern, and manage. And I'll just briefly highlight one approach or two approaches to show how governance of evolutionary innovation dynamics might happen. And one concept that has become quite popular is that of strategic niche management by Johann Schott and Frank Reels. The idea behind this is that basically the process is not easy to govern. And so what you can do is you can manage the niches at the local level of where innovation occurs. So you can try and create positive environments for developing new ideas. You can have manifold variations to develop. So that goes back to the evolutionary understanding, to have a lot of variation. And these niches have to be created. So in a strong selection environment with strong selection pressure, these niches are too small to actually develop and grow. So the idea within evolutionary innovation dynamics is that what you can actually do in terms of governing is to manage niches and to see if then the niche grows into something bigger. But that's nearly all you can do. You can't direct it, you can't strategically force it, but you can see how the niches are connected to larger dynamics, and you can try and foster that process. And from that, hopefully, a new technology or a new socio-technical dynamic will emerge. But you always have to be very much concerned with the local level. And this then relates into a larger understanding of how variation, selection, and retention can be mapped onto different levels, the micro, the meso, and the macro. So in the multi-level perspective, as it's called, to look at how innovations on the niche level, on the lower level, on the micro level of local practices, small networks, how they are influenced by larger dynamics on the landscape level or on the regime level, and how then these niches develop into a changing of the regime into new configurations. And so this is a very general understanding of how innovation can be governed in evolutionary dynamics. Basically, you can only care for the niches and try and make them grow into the regime, but you never know if they're going to work out. And one way of facilitating this process is to employ scenarios, socio-technical scenarios, so to really integrate uncertainties of developing processes into the production and the design process. So not to exclude uncertainties, but to really include the uncertainties of evolutionary innovation dynamics into the process of innovation itself. So this is basically one take on the innovation, on the governance of innovation, how you can actually try and address this wicked problem. But there are limits to this. And the limits are that you always encounter scaling issues. So if you help something on the local level, on the micro level, it's often quite difficult to scale it onto the regime level. And what we can see is that actually innovation policy is increasingly focused on actually looking at bottom-up grassroots innovation, especially in case of social innovations. And it often remains unclear how this local niche solution can be scaled up to a regional, national, or international level. The evolutionary perspective isn't a solution, but it makes you aware of specific problems. And if you look at social innovation specifically, you can see that actually a lot of the funding in innovation policy is directed towards funding novelty. So always having out calls for creating new forms, new ideas, but less for durability. So in the words of Paul Barilli, we could call this the raging standstill of social innovations, where you only go for novelty and novelty and novelty, but the innovation policy doesn't fund durability, the extension, the diffusion. This is often supposed to happen by itself because it is a good idea. So these are the limits that we have to be aware of, and from a science and technology perspective, we also have to be aware of that innovation governance, in a way, typically follows a pro-innovation bias. So innovation is set already as the answer to the problem. You don't ask, what might be the problem with the more and more innovation. Might innovation actually be more the problem than the solution? But we see that we have a strong pro-innovation bias in a lot of innovation governance, and not so much a critical perspective on this. And the research that I've done on social innovation shows that in many programs, social innovations are actually modeled after techno-economic innovations, so entrepreneurial innovations. So we again see how some thinking and ideas about innovation come back into other forms of innovation. And so like the entrepreneurial innovation is quite strong in this, and this is again something that can also be critiqued. And as I said then, innovation itself is not put in question anymore, but it has become taken for granted. So we just renew and reinforce and reify innovation over and over again. So coming to the second and brief point on how this evolutionary understanding might have become performative is to ask the question if this concept and what I've talked about briefly afterwards of evolutionary innovation studies has actually moved from an analytical and academic perspective to an instrumental and applied approach. So what we can see is that if we look at innovation governance, that innovation governance and funding programs are actually often modeled in a way after evolutionary dynamics. So it's about going for bottom-up processes. It's about finding niches, fostering niches, and looking at these programs, that seems to emphasize that actually the concepts of evolutionary innovation studies have diffused into governance circles. This then, as I also said on the last slide, creates a certain instrumental notion of, in a way, innovation being a tool for tapping into the creative reservoir at the micro level of civil society and local activities that have entrepreneurial action and a pro-innovation bias. So we see, again, even though we have different forms of innovation, we see the reification of a specific model of innovation. And another thing that I find quite interesting, and I'm happy to look into more in the coming projects, is that we can also see that it's not just governance, but that I would say a lot of these ideas of evolutionary innovation studies have also diffused into the economy, and especially when we look at digital platform enterprises and how they develop the platforms and the services they offer. That very much matches textbook evolutionary economics or evolutionary innovation studies. You know, you have you make a little niche, you try something out, then you try and scale it. And I think this is also because on digital platforms, it becomes a lot easier to do this kind of evolutionary approach, because the trying out is less difficult than with other products. And so from an STS perspective, I find that very interesting to look at how the concepts that were developed in STS, have now diffused into other circles, and how they now become performative when we look at how funding programs and how innovation strategies of companies are set up. They very much resemble evolutionary innovation studies. Okay, with that, I come to the conclusion, and basically the main thing that I wanted to bring across is that when we think about innovation governance, what I find interesting, at least, are two turns in this. And so the first turn was that innovation is considered not so much a mode of socio-technical change anymore, but a reflexive means of innovation governance. So innovation governance, in a way, emerges as innovation becomes a reflexive means and not a mode of social change anymore. And second, that with this innovation governance becoming and innovation becoming a reflexive means, we can see that analytic and academic concepts, for instance, from evolutionary innovation studies, turn to instrumental and applied approaches, for instance, in policy and economic circles. So here again, we have a turn with innovation, and again, these models then are not just descriptive, but become performative in the way that they then change innovation practices and the way that innovations are governed and managed. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentation, and I thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Cornelius. I think, or at least I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet, so we will encourage everybody to post questions in the chat. For those who came later, feel free also to write your questions in Portuguese. We'll translate them and ask them to our presenters. But if there are no questions for Cornelius yet, I suggest we look at the next presentation first, and then have a discussion round where we will reflect on the presentation by Cornelius as well as by Carolina Bacciatoli, who will be your next presenter. So Carolina, good to see you. Just a very short introduction. Carolina graduated in economics and has a master and PhD in science technology policy, and is a specialist in strategic public management and social economy and social technology. And she's currently associate professor at the Department of Economics and Public Policy graduate program, both at the Federal University of Paraná in Brazil. Yeah, with that, Carolina, the floor is yours. Like Cornelius, you have about 20 to 30 minutes for your presentation. And well, we have a discussion round afterwards.
Thank you, Rick. Hi, everyone. Well, it's a joy to be here today with Rick and Cornelius, two admirable scholars, to talk about innovation governance. Well, I will take a slightly different path from Cornelius. Let me just share my presentation. So I will start talking about governance in broader terms, from the policy analysis point of view, and then share some notes on innovation governance properly, considering the reality of peripheral countries. So let's start thinking about governance. What governance means? Well, governance is a buzzword. The concept is simultaneously polysemic and, in a certain way, vague, having a variety of meanings. While the traditional use of governance defines it as a synonym for governance, now more and more the term is being used referring to the new process of governing, or a changed condition of ordered rule, or even as the new method by which society is governed. Despite the polysemy, the different approach seems to share a common view that governance refers to the development of governing styles in which boundaries between and within public and private sectors have become blurred. It would imply interdependence of public, private, and voluntary sectors, usually associated with autonomous self-governing networks of actors. These networks can assume various forms of partnership as principal-agent relations, inter-organizational negotiation, and systemic coordination. Well, some phenomena help us to understand the emergency of the governance perspective in a broad sense, highlighting the welfare state's crisis and the advance of private participation in provision of public services, globalization and internationalization, creating new forms of relationship among national governments and the private sector, the transformations derived from the new public management and the new liberal mantra, the growing of individualism culture, and the challenges imposed to the representative democracy increasing demands for participation by citizens, pressuring public authorities to adopt more participatory forms of government. Well, among the potentialities of governance from an analytical perspective, stand out the recognition of the inherent complexity and dynamism of the policy process formulation, the participation of different actors in the process, the new government's stances, assuming new roles and reformulating policy instruments towards networks functioning. Regarding government practices, comparatively, while in the traditional governance state's role would be providing, ordering, and controlling, in the governance perspective, it would be more in terms of leading, enabling, facilitating, collaborating, and coordinating. Analogous, while the decision-making process in the traditional governance would be through administrative procedures and unilateral decisions, it will be through multilateral deliberation in the governance approach. As a result, the governance approach would go beyond representative democracy, resulting in a participative experiment. The previous put some light on some of the advantages of the governance perspective. But despite the evident benefits, the governance approach also presents some restraints, as indefinite or diffuse responsibility, which can blur duties, difficult accountability, potentially leading to blame avoidance or scapegoating. Problems of transparency and representativeness, as well as governance failure. Limited focus on power relations and the mechanisms that allow power exercise in policy sectors' interactions. Though it could be a minor problem in policy arenas compounded by relatively equal participants, it becomes relevant in contexts characterized by a significant unequal power distribution. It means that a proper use of the concept of governance in the analytical or normative way in peripheral countries, as the Latin American ones, must consider power asymmetries and conflict among the policy sectors in the governance space. In these countries, it does not hear the central presuppositions of the approach, like horizontality of the relationships, cooperation, the absence of conflict, or trust between actors in governance practices, be absent. As the governance approach does not recognize central elements in the exercise of power, making it invisible, in political arenas where participating heterogeneous political actors with an unequal power balance, those networks tend to reinforce the maintenance of established interests. Even a deliberative governance network can be it without being democratic. For doing so, the network must include different interests and discourses, which is not the rule. Well, considering the stated, we can say that, I got lost 2 minutes. Considering this stated, we can say that the governance of innovation indicates the existence of a multitude of actors that may be involved in the intricate actions and procedures that, together, lead to innovation. These actors may be firms, universities, financial organizations, lobbying groups, users, individuals, or governmental bodies with a different focus of interests. In being so, governance should be seen as the sum of various intentional measures that, together, direct an area or phenomenon in a certain direction. As a variety of processes where a set of different actors in various ways, together or separately, implement arrangements that aim to influence the innovation input, process, and outcome. The argument on innovation governance stressed that in the recent decades has been a move from traditional top-down or orchestrated governance modes to a more distributed forms. The argument is that hard governance arrangements, such as regulation or taxes, have given way to softer modes, where governance earlier was seen as almost synonymous with government actions. Today, government often takes a less profound hold or collaborates with private actors. The changes in the ways of doing science, technology, and innovation observed in the last decades would have demanded new modes of governance. In this sense, thinking about innovation governance implies taking a closer look at the articulation, or lack thereof, among actors involved in innovation practice, innovation-related public intervention strategies, and innovation research and theory, where mutual learning through interacting constantly creates and changes innovation, policy, and theory configurations. It is through this interaction that one can assess the rationales and the relevance of innovation policy in emerging countries. Furthermore, it helps not only to identify the main rationales behind innovation policies, practices, and theories applied in those countries, but also to identify the lack of relevance when policies do not correspond coherently to relevant theories, when theories do not respond to or reflect relevant practices, and when practices do not respond to relevant policies, and vice versa. Let's examine those three pillars of innovation governance: actors, intervention strategies, and theories. Regarding the actors involved in innovation practice, the vast and diverse literature related to technology and innovation production tend to converge and highlight the role of the trinomial: government agencies and public authorities, researchers and scholars, and entrepreneurs and innovators. Several alternative innovation concepts rely on the assumption that those different actors are articulated in interactive and interdependently ways. It is the case of user-driven innovation, social innovation, as Cornelius just said, and responsible innovation, to mention few examples. In respect to innovation theories and frameworks, the main point is that public policies and even business practices of innovation, to some extent, are more often than not inspired by models, theories, paradigms, approaches, frameworks, concepts, or assumptions. These sources of ideas can be categorized as irrelevant when they are designing and assuming contexts that do not match the application scenario and, therefore, lead to ignoring local reality. This point is quite important and worth to be better explored. Adopting frameworks and theories derived of socioeconomic realities diverse of the local context can lead to different kinds of theoretical failures, resulting in wrong design and or implementation failures of innovation policies. Any public policy is based on a theory of change, with a representation of how an organization expects to achieve the desired results and an identification of its underlying presuppositions. It comprehends a causality model, usually implicit, partial, or even indefinite, composed of a causal hypothesis and an interventional hypothesis, whose validity can be tested only during implementation and evaluation of observed effects or not. Theories and frameworks on innovation policy play a crucial role in the definition of the causality model. It means that the adoption of a theoretical basis with underlying assumptions failure, leading to a false or incomplete causal hypothesis, may result in misleading innovation policy and harmful effects, mainly in emerging countries. Policies based on models as the linear model of innovation, which assumes that the innovation process is explained by a relatively straight line with a clearly delineated progression from basic research to applied research, demonstration, and full-scale development. Or the national system of innovation, which, by highlighting the importance of different types of actors and roles to explain how innovation results, tending to be taken as normative framework, leading to undermining institutional learning and evolutionary process and determinants, or even the triple helix model, which tends to be taken as normative model in emerging countries, leading potentially to extreme cases of commercialization or privatization of knowledge produced at public universities on those countries, are just some examples of how the adoption and manipulation of theories and frameworks may mislead innovation policy. It means that if the innovation policy causality model is based on inaccuracies that by becoming normative models may lead or have led to public policies oriented to solving the wrong problem, the harming effect resulting is related to the fact that they constitute sources of distraction for policy and practice, causing high opportunity costs by diverting focus away from the real and perhaps more pressing but less organized and therefore recognized problems, and avoid implementation of innovation policies and practices more adjusted to local needs, capabilities, and realities. These models may inspire in the design and implementation of innovation public policies and practices that can, in fact, be both irrelevant, not taking into account emerging countries' needs and capabilities, and, more importantly, naive, not considering emerging countries' specificities and political and institutional contexts. Furthermore, theoretical shortcomings involve situations in which the models are copied, a very common practice in emerging countries called isomorphism, which, if combined with inaccurate design or biased interpretation, lead to policies, programs, and projects that not only do not contribute to solve the problems that motivated their application, but that possibly generated new problems. Not here, isomorphic policies ends up aiming to solving the wrong problem because of, among other factors, policies and programs are inspired by a bad or wrong causal theory or assumptions. Expected policy outcomes are, to some extent, consequences of the problem definition. A wrong formulation of the causal and or the intervention hypothesis can certainly compromise the results. Expected policy outcomes in isomorphic policies may be frustrated because the socioeconomic context can differ as the determinants of policy actors' behavior, and the causal link verified in the past cannot repeat itself. A common cause of committing policy design to solve the wrong problem is the fact that decision makers frequently act as solution advocates rather than as problem advocates. In emerging countries, it is extremely common that policymakers implement preferred solutions rather than appropriate solutions, as could be, for example, the stimuli for technological modernization, socio-technical adequacy, and even technology for social inclusion rather than innovation. Part of the reasons explaining why decision makers frequently play the role of solution advocates rather than their role of problem advocates has to do with the absence of space for deliberation and citizen participation, as well as a limited capacity of critical analysis and assessment of policies and accountability by different actors. Nevertheless, the mere existence of spaces for deliberation and citizen participation does not guarantee changes in the policy process. The high degree of specificity and complexity of scientific knowledge can lead the participants of the deliberative process to legitimize political decisions previously defined by the dominant actors, making control and authority in the decision-making process of science, technology, and innovation policies focus on experts. In the case of innovation policies specifically, where greater interest and, consequently, participation of the business sector would be expected, this is not observed in peripheral realities. Probably it is due to the low importance attributed to innovation in the business strategy of companies in emerging economies such as the Latin Americas. While governance as analytical approach stress the increasing participation of different actors in the policy process, pressuring governments to assume new roles, reformulating policy instruments towards networks functioning, when one looks at the innovation governance at peripheral countries, faces to a different reality. There are few participatory spaces in the policy arena, and even where they exist, one can observe a dynamic marked by an absence of actual participation, problems of representativeness, with large civil society sectors not invited to those circles, and a participatory dynamic that more legitimate action courses previously stipulated more than defining policy agenda. In other words, in arenas involving heterogeneous political actors with unequal power balance, governance networks tend to reinforce the maintenance of established interests. Together, those kind of innovation governance failures, incorrect theoretical assumptions, disregard local capacities, needs and barriers, representativeness problems, conflict in power relations, to mention just the most sensitive, would explain at least partially why knowledge and innovation fail to successfully contribute to progress in emerging countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Very interesting. A very nice complementarity with Cornelius' presentation. It was more on the innovation side, and from there on moved to governance. And you approached a bit from the other side, started with governance and worked towards the innovation perspective. So very nice to see those two presentations together. I've been looking at the chat. There's at least one question by Tiago. Another one has been announced. I'm sure it will come in a minute as well. So this first question goes to Cornelius, and it refers to innovation as motor, innovation as means that you've been presenting, where you also show that it's kind of a change over time. But the question here is whether it's also a change related to different disciplinary approaches. So does this also have to do with the view of the researcher, how this, how innovation is approached, seen as a mode or as a means?
Yeah, first of all, my idea was to use that as a historical differentiation that typically in basically most of the literature, innovation used to be considered a mode of change. Then I think you can see it that then in the second part of the 20th century, this argumentation changes towards the means when management of innovation, governance of innovation becomes more important in the academic discussion. And then I think also disciplines which have a stronger focus on implementing change, for instance, management studies, they're more focused on developing means. Also, political studies, for political science, how can we initiate social change? And so it's those normative disciplines, who look to the instrument more closely, whereas at least for a large part of sociology, they still try to use innovation as an analytic tool to describe the way that society changes without turning it into a normative concept. But I think that when I look at the literature, that slowly fades out in the 1970s or 80s, when basically the talk of innovation becomes so dominant that talking about it as a solution to a societal problem really becomes the main focus. This is then also when evolutionary innovation studies emerge, I think, as a counter towards this more and more instrumental notion. It's never been purely instrumental. There's always been research that looked at it more as a mode of change and from a more analytic and descriptive. But I think on the majority, and especially the closer we get to policy and the economy, the more instrumental it gets. And then we have then we of course have the disciplines that are closer to the economy and to politics, and I think that the instrumental notions are much more prominent with them than with disciplines who are further away from the normative questions and giving advice to people in policy or the economy. So I think that really emerged as the instrumental notion became more prominent, that we had a division between the disciplines. Before, I don't think it was very much a disciplinary distinction.
All right, thank you very much. Let me just have a quick look at the chat again. Yeah, there's another question addressed mainly at Cornelius, but I think could be interesting for Carolina to answer as well. That relates to the concept of triple helix, quadruple helix, quintuple helix, and how these modes, or these models rather, are relevant or maybe also not in the discussion of innovation governance. So question first he addressed at Cornelius, but I think maybe it also relates to Carolina, who also been talking about new actors in governance, which is basically what especially the quadruple helix is also about, I guess. So who wants to give it a first shot? Maybe Cornelius, the question was addressed at you first.
Well, yeah, thank you. A very nice question. So I think talking about the triple helix, quadruple helix, quintuple helix, it really looks at the central tension of innovation governance. And so they are absolutely central models for this, because the original triple helix specifically looks at how can science, industry, and policy work together to create innovation. And so it's I think for discussing innovation governance today, what we can see with the helix models is that they increasingly take on complexity. So it goes from a triple helix to a quadruple helix to a quintuple helix. There might be more as innovation studies and the governance of innovation studies realizes that the problems are much more complex than facilitating basic research that will then push out into society. And so I think the governance question is very, very closely related to the question of complexity in innovation processes, and the helix model and also the co-creation models, they reflect this increasing complexity that is being acknowledged by the actors in the field. And so this is why I think they're extremely closely related.
Well, first of all, I agree with Cornelius, mainly from the analytical perspective. Thinking in a normative way, or let me put in other words, thinking from a peripheral country, from a Latin American country, I think maybe the use of these concepts should be more contextualized. What I'm saying, so usually these systemic models are created from a specific reality, a specific context from developed countries that do not happen in peripheral countries. So when policymakers adopt these concepts in peripheral realities, they transform a concept or a model or analytical framework that started as a descriptive framework, or at the most framework that summarizes the main characteristics of the innovation process in those realities, And then in this isomorphic pressure, it becomes a normative framework here in peripheral countries. And that could be a problem, obviously, as I tried to highlight in my presentation. If a public policy, any public policy, the STI wouldn't be different. If a public policy departs from a wrong diagnosis of the problems, of the reality, of the actors, of the relationship, obviously the results will be failure, the minimum, or harmful, or even catastrophic, if you think in some realities. So my concerns about the use of these concepts when we look at the peripheral realities is that mostly it used in an uncritical way, mainly adopting as a normative models more than just descriptive, or at least not looking at the different specifics of this context and what we should balance then before use it even as an analytical tool.
Yeah, I would actually say that's similar, at least from what I can say about Germany. That's many of these concepts also here, they use too much, I think, at least in my perspective, as a kind of a normative goal, indeed, about public participation, bringing people into the process, but without asking really the right questions, or without having the right institutions in place to actually involve citizens. So I don't think that's a specific challenge. It's definitely a different challenge in different cultures and in different institutional contexts. But it's very much the same, at least in my experience in Germany as well, where, well, often those concepts are not used critically enough. There's not enough reflection on how to use them, I think. But it's very interesting to hear your perspective on that as well, and see how that's the case for Brazil. Yeah, let me have a look at some further questions. Yeah, so we have the question here addressed again at Cornelius, who mentioned salutary move from analytical prescriptive role to a performative role of innovation governance. And so the question is, how can we promote this performative role of innovation governance? What instruments are there?
Well, actually, I would be a little bit hesitant to promote this, because I was trying to, or at least from my perspective, and fully agree with Carolina, is that if we take these models naively and simple and try and turn them into instruments, we're probably doing more harm than good. And so I think we must first be aware of that these models aren't just descriptive and analytical, but that they do have impact, and that they're not neutral. First of all, you know, they always come with baggage, and I think this is the important point to make, that if we employ these models, we must always look at, okay, what's their background and what do they bring with them? And that's what I looked at when I looked at the social innovation policies on the EU level. I found it striking how in the discourse of social innovation, which is good for society and good for the people and bottom up, we have a basic resonance of, you know, an entrepreneurial society where basically everybody has to become active, and the state drawing back and wanting people to fill the gap that now exists because policies failed and markets failed, and now it's for the civil society to fill these gaps. And so there is a strong neoliberal resonance in this, which I think we should be critical of if we use these instruments. And then we have the if we have the instruments, then we must look at how can they actually then promote change. If we look at change, how they can actually do that, and how the change can then actually be scaled, because that's in a lot of the concepts, that's as Rick just said, we don't really know how these things function yet. So we have very large, broad models, but we scaling from local practices to regional practices, to national practices, to international practices is extremely difficult. So I think we should, if we take the notion of the performative innovation concept seriously, we should really be reflexive about them, be critical about them, and then see, okay, if we employ them, what are we going to do? And I think that's the important point to be taken here, that we can't, or that's at least my perspective from like a critical science and technology studies perspective, is that the instruments are never neutral. And as soon as we implement them, we will create some change. And typically, and I might be very cautious as a sociologist here, you know, typically we don't know about the consequences, and so I'm very I'm very sorry, but I am somehow still reluctant to advertise the performative role of the concepts in a normative matter.
Thanks. Yeah, so actually, as you were just talking now about also about scaling and going from local to regional, and you showed the multi-level perspective where the niches have to, well, find a place within the regime. I actually was thinking there also, you talked about strategic niche management, and you talk now about the emergence of innovation, and well, you're cautious in actually talking about supporting also innovations and in this direction. But it still got me thinking about, well, do we also need to have some kind of innovation policies? And I guess this question again goes to both of you, that actually deal with the existing regime with concepts such as ex-innovation, so about opening space for new innovations, especially thinking about issues such as sustainability, or maybe also social innovations directed at inclusivity, at empowerment. So do we need to also focus specifically on the governance of, well, removing old innovations or creating space, breaking up the regime, ex-innovation, however you want to frame it? But so this other side of the coin, so to say. Anyone wants to go first? Cornelius, yes, please.
I have an answer, or I have a reply, but I'm happy for Carolina to go first if you want to.
No, it's fine. I'm actually, how can I say, boiling with this conversation and the topics in the chat. But I'm not sociologist, I'm an economist, I'm sorry. But even though I am quite concerned in this performative use, I mean, it seems like there are delicate barriers here in this area. I mean, of how we use these concepts or frameworks, theories, as analytical tool, and then as basis for narratives that are used to legitimate policy actions, and then these models became performative, became normative, even though they were not thinking like that in the beginning. And since we are talking about science, technology, I mean, all the narratives are full with the discourses of rationality, scientific knowledge. So all these arguments, the theories have an area, looks like so scientific, so concrete, so, I mean, so flawless, that becomes more difficult to deconstruct this and problematize it in policy arenas. I think it's quite problematic. I will take the chance, if you don't mind, to add some comments on one of the questions from Renato Dagnino. He was my master, my director, but my master. I say he's always my master. And his question is pretty much in the same line. I mean, Here in Latin America, we have a traditional school of thought, or think tanks, if you can say like that, in the 70s, maybe before in the 60s, but from 60s to 80s, let me say. It's Latin American thought on science and technology. And it was approached, it was a tentative for different scholars to think Latin American reality from our local needs, capabilities, constraints, socioeconomic context, actors, resources, limits, etc. And it's interesting because, well, it was a quite original school and production in that moment, as you can imagine. And it's interesting because even it was so original that some ideas, for example, we can find the triple helix later from Etzkovitz, were presented by Argentine called Jorge Sabato. The same thing, but he used the figure of a triangle. But if I had here, I could show you that years before Etzkovitz, the same idea was present here. What is it? So I'm not saying people here was speaking something quite different of what probably they were saying outside, but they were looking from inside. It was an attempt to make a diagnosis from the local reality. I mean, it was the most closer to appropriate thinking or frameworks or narratives, theories from our reality. I mean, a perspective thinking, considering the local context to do for or to be the basis of policy action. Well, in the 90s, all this was lost. When we have the neoliberal forces and all the changes in the collective thinking about state's role, relationship between state, private, between public sector and private sector, all this background was lost. I mean, if you talk with any policymaker in different Latin American countries, or even scholars, not just policymakers, they will use mostly just the frameworks, the narratives, the theories developed in developed countries, which would not be a problem if we could observe attempt to contextualize or compare or look at our reality and see how it is close to our reality. It is adherent. It represents what we observe here. It represents our historical background, our socioeconomic conditions, the actors. We can say firms here act as firms in Germany, United States. Innovation has the same purpose here in the business strategy as we can say in France, for example, or United Kingdom. Absolutely not. So it's such a loss here in the Latin American case specifically. It's a step back, a huge step back in this discussion.
Yes, if I can I can't add to that, but what I'm also thinking about is that when we look at science and technology studies, and this is an argument that has been made by Stephen Jackson, is that science and technology studies from the global north perspective have focused very much on innovation projects, a lot of failed innovation projects. If we look at the seminal studies, so they always, or they very much are occupying themselves with showing how innovation has actually failed, which is a fate of a lot of innovations. But what he says is that they still buy into the innovation paradigm. So that innovation is being taken for granted. Innovation is what we need to do. And he says we should consider other concepts more than simply innovation, for instance, repair. And if you look at what Ogburn wrote on the cultural lag, his innovations are basically repair innovations. So it's innovations that need to be made because innovations have caused disruptions in society. And so you then use innovation, counter innovation, which again creates creative destruction, and then you create basically a vicious cycle of pressure to adapt, pressure to change, pressure to adapt. And so I think one of the problems when, and I think this is also true for science, technology, and innovation studies, is if we remain within the innovation paradigm and use these concepts, we often get stuck with them, and it's very difficult to break out of that paradigm and look for other concepts that might actually be more useful than looking for the diffusion patterns of novelties. And we would then have to think, okay, what kind of novelties? Are they novelties for change, or are they novelties to repair and to conserve and to reform in the original sense? And so that would give us a different perspective of how to think about innovation and the governance of innovation.
Thanks. Related to this, actually, it was one of the first things I wrote down as you were presenting. Should we maybe worry about kind of inflation of the term innovation? Is been using too much, and do we indeed need other concepts such as repair? Or are, in your opinion, all those types of innovation, social innovation, sustainable innovation, responsible innovation, you named them, are they helping us in finding different nuances within innovation, or is it really just inflating innovation so much that we should indeed look at different concepts, look at ideas like repair, focus maybe separately on things like basic research or applied research, and then technological development from there, which have kind of merged in innovation and innovation policy? Is innovation still a useful term in that sense, and can it still be governed?
Yeah, I think we don't really have a chance not to use it because it's so extremely prominent within the field. But we might have to think about our use of the term. So we kind of have to use it as a descriptive term, and in the way that the fields that we research describe themselves if they use the term. And so we have this huge proliferation of innovation and of different types of innovation. And this is how we need to label and coin them. But I think at the same time, we have to do work to think about, okay, what kind of innovation is that for us? So we can't take the terms at face value, but we really have to put more academic and reflexive and critical work into understanding how this proliferation of innovation, this huge expansion of innovation, can be analyzed without basically following the same expansion logic, but to become more distance and more analytic in a way, and so not to fall for the incredibly large funding pots, at least in the global north, that are being tipped out with new innovations as they come around. So it's very tempting to go for all these innovations and be part of that. But I think as critical scholars of innovation processes, we should really, I don't think we need to abandon the term, but we really should turn it into an analytical concept and go back to the question of, okay, what does it mean if we speak about innovation? And I think this is then often lost in the discussion.
I think this point is quite interesting. I just finished a paper on the uses of these concepts in policy narratives, social, inclusive, green innovation. So in this paper, I look how these concepts are used in international organizations as OECD, European Commission, and lost the name in English, but the Inter-American Development Bank. Sorry if someone remember the English the English mentioned, please just add. And what I think was the most interesting conclusion I got from this effort is that in this international organization, these policy sectors, narratives, those concepts are not used first. They are really little pervasiveness. I mean, they are not really used. They are not used frequently in the narratives of those organizations. But more, when we see how they use these concepts, even when the concept in the literature try to be alternative to technological innovation, mainly considering the economic dimension or the economic bias from the technological innovation concept, when they are operated, they do not have this alternative connotation. I mean, when we see how these organizations use these concepts, they do not break with the economic foundation, the economic perspective of technological innovation. So they're pretty much used. They tend to be alternative, but in the way they are used, they are not alternative really to technological innovation. They are used more as complementary, or just trying to put some light in different perspectives, more, for example, more the participatory dimension as user-driven, or the need to think in the impacts of the innovation as the responsible innovation. I'm saying that not to say that I think we should abandon this concept. Like Cornelius say, I agree with you, but maybe to give a step back and look at another concepts, another process, another STI process, as you mentioned before, or we can use another concept. For example, sometimes the local needs do not need innovation. If we are trying to attend local needs, sometimes what we need is just modernization. It's just technological adaptation. I mean, say something like that nowadays seems like embarrassing. Like, it's a shame. You are a heterogeneous person. How you are saying sometimes we don't need innovation, but that's the truth. When you see the reality, again, of peripheral countries, and I know there are countries in a very bad, even worse situation than the Latin American ones. Sometimes what these people need, it's not innovation. I mean, at least not technological innovation. Sometimes the needs local people have are needs that could be solved by simple solutions. But the narrative, the innovation is such a buzzword that make a cloudy situation where people do not look at the side. I mean, it's like there is nothing else besides innovation. So, or we have basic research or innovation. There is nothing left. It's like there is nothing left in the between, which is not true. Absolutely. So my point, when I stress, we should start by looking at local realities, capabilities, needs, is like that. I mean, if your intention is use this process to contribute for well-being from the people or to solve social problems, we should start looking at it. What these people need. I mean, I know someone in Brazil, someone in Germany or Netherlands have to breathe. This is the same. Okay, have to eat. This is the same. But despite that, the needs can be totally different. I mean, one third of the people in Brazil does not have water in the home, proper water, clean water. So this is our reality. I mean, why some people here, my colleagues, are defending more and more technological innovation, despite look at the side. I mean, so for me, this is a critical question. We should look and we should think about it when we are talking we are talking about some dimensions of this process as innovation governance. I mean, what innovation we are talking about? What are we talking about? Let's define it. I mean, is this the phenomenon, the process we want? We think it's the most appropriate. We should stress, we should develop, we should reinforce.
Yeah, I think that of course relates very much to what you actually mentioned in your presentation, and that we need problem advocates. We need to look more at where the problem is and not at the solution we've come up with beforehand. And I think that's very true. That's very important. I'm redirecting the attention to the chat, and there's actually a comment, or well, it's 3 comments in a row by Shamilia Souza. Maybe you have a look at it yourself as well in parallel. Who writes, agree with Cornelius. I think it was about the performativity of innovations. I do not exactly agree with Carolina's evaluation. Yeah, there we see it also on the screen. Because there is one example I can offer where I was asked to develop a performative role of innovation governance for organization in Brazil that you might be more aware of than I am. The issue here are preconceptions, misconceptions on decision making. So I invite you to verify this real world experience by the partnership. Yeah, as I'm sure we can definitely learn from one another. So very clear comment towards you, Carolina. I don't know how far you know the examples and can respond right away, or whether this is more something to discuss afterwards, but maybe you can already give us some hints and some answers.
No, it's fine. Shamila, thank you for your comment. Fiocruz is one of these Brazilian institutions that most have my respect and admire, because they have a work spectacular, and probably if we think in exceptions of course, what I talk was like a was more about the tendency. It does not mean every institution, every experience happen the same way. And if I have to point some institution, some space of STI development in Brazil, doing something differently, doing something the way it should be, it's obviously would be Fiocruz. So for who does not know, Fiocruz is one of our biggest public institutions in the health area, and they are working with research from basic research to production of pharmaceutical products, vaccines, etc. So it's a huge institution with a historical position, very strong, and with initiatives that are marvelous. And even because of that, in governments who, when we are under governments who are not quite positivist, or maybe in governance with more in a fascist perspective as our actual government, institutions as Fiocruz are under attack. So I agree with you, Sharmila. I think it's not always like that. But what I'm saying, and this I still maintain, I think this is the most observed. When we talk about the national policy, the STI national policy, for example, when we see the national government plans in the STI area, what we can see is behaviors like that. I mean, I'm examining these narratives, these national plans for 15 years in Brazil. And it's pretty much the same. We can even identify the same words every time to times, government to governments, the same words, the same priority areas, the same intervention mechanisms in the national policy. Obviously, of course, there are exceptions, and thanks God there are exceptions. This is due to different factors. I mean, in some areas, in some institutions, there are people who for example, has more freedom to adapt, to do different stuff from the bigger narrative. We have some background, political, historical background institutions as Fiocruz that makes these kind of institutions make nice, marvelous initiatives, as probably the one you are mentioning that I don't know it exactly. Just to make another example, using the same institution, now in Brazil are consolidating like a national association for people who are doing research or developing technologies for social inclusion. And lots of people who are talking in this association are from Fiocruz, but they are known from the National Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation. Just to make a really small example, to mention that what I'm saying is about the big picture, the bigger tendency. But obviously, it's not a neutral field. It's not a homogeneous field. The academic community is heterogeneous. So even though we can see like a big tendency, we can see, again, thank the Lord, we can see people who go in the other direction, in a more critical perspective, etc. Thank you again, Sharmila.
Yes, I also think that science and technology studies concepts can be very useful in facilitating participation and getting people together. And my critique was towards that, interestingly, when they become parts of governance programs, you know, they lose some of this, and you know, for instance, then competition is more in the fore, and so they're being transformed, and then we have only a partial perspective of what the original academic concept was, that then becomes performative, and especially in evolutionary innovation studies, you know, then it's the competition that might be highlighted, that you need competition, and that, you know, brings about the best solution, and that's absolutely not what evolutionary economy or evolutionary innovation studies would say. And so I think we really should do this, and I know this from the project when I'm involved with colleagues, for instance, from computer science, and we design together with users. My first statement with them when we start the collaboration is, if you collaborate with me, it will take a lot longer than you expect now, and it will be much more difficult than you think, and you might not actually end up with a solution. But you will rethink the process in different ways, and that's also already a good thing. And so I think we should really engage in these projects, and we should then say, okay, what we can point to are the consequences that might follow from this, and we can show the complexity. And I think we're the antidote towards reductionism, you know, just looking for the techno-economic dynamics, you know, so no, it is broader, and change is difficult, and we really have to take the local micro-level perspective into account to facilitate participation. So I think I fully agree, you know, we have to do it more, but it's especially in a lot of or in most policy or economic circles, this reasoning is more difficult to sell because it's slower, it doesn't deliver, or it doesn't promise to deliver as fast, you know, and so it would require a rethinking of the way in which policy instruments are being implemented. So it would require a new way of governing, basically, to really take these concepts at their full value.
All right, thanks. I've got one more question here that, well, goes a little bit in a different direction, but actually maybe it also fits to what you've just been saying, because it's about the role of the state in governance and in innovation, governance, innovation policy. So the question states here that public authorities seem to have lost the initiative regarding innovation. At least I think their role has been changing. So we see indeed that there are other actors coming involved in the governance process. We saw that in Carolina's presentation as well, and it's also a development that we see over time. And so the question is a little bit, well, why do you think the states have or state authorities have lost this initiative? And I would like to add to that, if we are more reliant now on private organizations, in how far can we rely on them? So in how far is it kind of acceptable maybe to have less of a role for state authorities and for public authorities? If we think about the challenges that we're facing with regards to, well, let's take it broadly as the Sustainable Development Goals. So sustainability, climate change, but also issues of poverty, inclusivity. So in how far do you think it's, in how far did the state lose that control or that initiative? And in how far is it acceptable, or should they maybe get a bigger role again in innovation policies? Who wants to go first?
I think it should be nicer Cornelius go first.
No, that is a difficult question. So I don't really know why the state authorities have declined in that effort. It might not be true for every country, so I really think we should really then look at every state authority and what they actually do, because we somehow see also in the internationalization and in the isomorphic pressures created, by the global innovation paradigm, that innovation kind of also is on the rise. But the question is, in how far do the states take the lead, or the governmental actors? And I think they've basically, or at least my initial explanation would be that they also realized the complexity, after like the hype in doing all this in the 60s and 70s and maybe even 80s, and then building these models, they the actors in state agencies, first of all, have less money, so they don't really know where to spend it. So there's less money to spend, and they realize that looking back, a lot of the efforts actually haven't worked out, so they weren't able to scale, and so they become more cautious in this. And then, of course, it's easier to draw back and say, let's have civil society have a go, and let's have private actors have a go. And so I'm not sure if it is just a matter of decreasing funds, or just a matter of becoming aware of the limits of governance within policy. Or if it's a more general trend, I really honestly don't know. But what I think state actors should do is to become more involved, but also, of course, more reflexively involved in the way that they shouldn't just copy innovation instruments or recipes, but to become involved as an actor who has connections to the local circumstances, and say, okay, what do we actually need, and what are our problems, And so I think states actually do need to be involved more, absolutely. But that's maybe because I'm a sociologist, and I think there's value in that. But also being involved in some of these state initiatives, I've sometimes perceived state authorities to be quite cautious, and then they're sometimes I think they're under a lot of pressure from a lot of sides, and so they'd rather of course, like the EU puts out humongous amounts of money for innovation purposes, but it's I wouldn't say that they really that's a bit too harsh, maybe, that they don't try to understand innovation. But I would say that if we want to bring state actors into the picture more, we would have to rethink the way that innovation governance is organized, and to make it more open towards other forms of innovation, and to think about how this can become part of it. Otherwise, they will just become, you know, the money givers to whatever goes around, you know, and then we're in a kind of a market-like setting where, you know, there's just funds to be had, and then you apply for funding, and you go for projects, and it doesn't enter into a stable phase of, you know, actually putting a novelty into a durable arrangement and basically, you know, trying to make that a more solid change. Sorry, long answer, not really getting to the point, but it was a difficult question.
No, it's a fine answer, thanks.
I think there is no easy answer for this kind of question, so don't feel bad, Cornelius. I ask you to comment first, because for me this is a kind of perspective or point of dimension that's probably very different from country to country, as you mentioned. I will talk a bit as the Brazilian reality, and again from the national policy, how the national policy used to work. So once I spent a year taking a look in the decisional process in the national policy. So how is the hierarchy, how the institutions are connected, who takes the decision, how the decision is taken, who is invited to participate or not, etc. So when you look to the decisional boards from the national authorities of the STI policy, the STI policy have different boards for different big areas. When you look who is in these boards, are mainly some bureaucrats, but mostly researchers, like very well researchers, Brazilian researchers, or academic, internationally recognized academic. They're invited to sit, to occupy these positions in these boards. And many of them also invite representatives from the firms, from the entrepreneurs. But those rarely make use of these invitations. So many of these positions, for different reasons, in many of these boards, most of the decision making are in the hands of the scientific community, or because they are just invited, or which is common here in Brazil, because they're invited to occupy bigger positions in the institutional machine, let's say the minister, the secretary, the main secretary, the first secretary, second, etc. So we have here a dynamic that invites or give the biggest positions to a scientific community, and a business sector that do not really cares about STI questions. So if we take a look in what business sector says about innovation or technology innovation in the innovation surveys here, they say, "Oh, I do not innovate because I have another issues in my mind. I mean, I have to take a look in the exchange rate, in inflation, in economic growth, in human resources." So, so we have a dynamic in the national organizations responsible for STI policy, national STI policy, domained by scientific community. So in a certain way, in Brazil, usually business sector, the private sector, do not make big investments in the area. Usually not. When we see how much the private sector perform in STI activities, mainly technology and innovation activities, considerable part of this, 1/3 at least, maybe more, are from public resources. So I would say that here in Brazil, we have like public authorities, government, given decision-making positions more to research community, but in terms of funding, resource or funding those activities. Government, the national state is, even nowadays, they mainly founder. So it's intriguing because the state is present funding, a bit less present taking the decision making, or is present but open the spaces, the decision making spaces for the scientific community. The reasons for this could be many. I mean, when we look at the surveys of public perception of science, for example, in Brazil, most of the population believes these decisions should be taken by scientists. They believe government should not interfere in these dynamics, in the decision-making process, for example. Maybe this is one of the reasons for this dynamic. But maybe there are others. I mean, when we see the dominant values or myths around science, technology, and society relationships, we can see, like, usually this perception that the scientist should be the person, the actor to be listed in the STI policy process is dominant. It's not specific here from Brazil. So, I mean, it's a combination of factors that can explain that. But I would say that maybe in the peripheral countries, this absence of government institutions are more in terms of who should decide, or who actor should decide the ways the STI policy should go, the paths, than in funding terms. Even though in the last 5 years, the funding in Brazil have decreased to 1/4, more or less, than in the 5 years before. But pretty much I think is that, but as Cornelius said, is quite a difficult question. We could do another conference just to talking about it.
Thanks. Yeah, indeed. And actually, hearing you speak now about Brazil and the role of companies, I think it also calls for comparative study between Germany and Brazil, where especially the automotive companies, of course, they're very big and also well, at least more prominent in these kind of debates. So of course, this is also a local issue, but very interesting, and we can indeed talk a lot more about this, which I'd say we should do in maybe some other session or some other virtual meeting. As it's time to close off now, I don't see any more comments in the chat. So I thank you both very much for your presentation and the discussion. I thank the participants for the questions they've posed. It's a very interesting and very nice debate with a nice comparison, I think, between the, let's say, Northwestern European or German-Dutch views and the Brazilian perspective. So that's very nice to get these insights and to get this discussion started. And I think indeed it's more of a start for a discussion than an end, because there are a lot of things that we can still talk about in this context. So thank you all very much. And I think the next session will be next week in this STS colloquium. Thanks.